Today, we're opening 4 dusty case files and stepping straight into the shadows where justice almost slipped away. Sarasota, 1985. A bright young mother, Denise Marie Stafford, found dead in her own home, her baby crying in the next room. One strand of DNA would wait 36 years to speak, and when it finally did, the killer was already in the grave. Carmel, 1981. Sonia Denham Stone, Levi's sales representative, murdered before lunch. A mysterious scratch on the neighbor's face, a witness who reversed her story, and a courtroom that called it all fruit of the poisonous tree. 4 decades later, detectives returned in Denham to arrest a grandfather. Florida, 2000 to 2001. 3 young women, Kimberly, Simus, Jessica, vanish into the night, only to resurface as murder victims bound by the same brutal signature. The prime suspect? A charismatic Brazilian playboy who fled the country and maybe faked his own death. Albuquerque, 1988 to 1989. 2 college co-aides, Althea Oakley and Caitlin Arquette, gunned down a year apart. Their families battled silence for 32 years until the killer walked into a police station and confessed, claiming God told him to. 4 stories of evidence lost, leads frozen, and families refusing to quit. 4 reminders that killers can run, hide, even die. But the truth keeps breathing. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and stay right here. Because in the next few minutes, we'll retrace each nightmare, reveal the breakthroughs that crack them open, and ask the question every cold case detective lives for. What finally turns a whisper in the dark into the verdict that ends the hunt? Let's flip the first file, grab a snack, dim the lights, and join me as we decode clues, pit science against secrecy, and honor the victims whose voices refuse to vanish. Their stories start right now, together. Case file number 1, the murder of Denise Marie Stafford. On the morning of October 13th, 1985, the Sarasota Police Department responded to a series of distressing phone calls that led them to a quiet home on Tarpon Avenue. There, they discovered the lifeless body of 28-year-old Denise Marie Stafford, a young mother whose life had been tragically cut short. Her husband, Frank Stafford, had arrived at the house earlier that day, only to stumble upon the devastating scene. Inside the home, their 1-year-old daughter was found unharmed in another room, alive and unaware of the horror that had unfolded nearby. Denise was well known in her community as a warm-hearted, cheerful, and kind individual. Friends and neighbors described her as a joyful spirit, always full of life and compassion. Her shocking death sent ripples through the neighborhood, leaving many in disbelief. Who could have committed such a brutal act against someone so beloved? The initial investigation revealed that Denise had likely been killed sometime between the late hours of October 12th, around 11 p.m., and the early morning hours of October 13th, roughly 3:10 a.m. Crime scene investigators meticulously combed through the residence, analyzing every piece of evidence in the hopes of identifying the perpetrator. However, forensic technology in 1985 had its limits, and despite the police's best efforts, leads dried up and the case eventually went cold. A glimmer of hope emerged when investigators identified a potential suspect, Joseph Mogg Letty Jr., a former bouncer at a now-closed lounge and restaurant frequently visited by Denise and her husband. While suspicion lingered, there was insufficient evidence to connect him to the crime, and he was released without charges. As the years passed, the case slipped further into obscurity, leaving the Stafford family without answers. It wasn't until 2021, more than 3 decades later, that a breakthrough reignited the investigation. Thanks to advances in forensic science, particularly DNA testing, the Sarasota Police Department reopened the case. Civilian investigator Jeff Birdwell spearheaded the renewed effort. He re-examined the original evidence and theorized that Denise had been standing at the time of the attack, before being forcibly pinned to the ground. With this insight, Birdwell focused on specific areas of Denise's clothing, where the assailant may have gripped her, and sent those samples for DNA analysis. The results were undeniable. The DNA matched that of Joseph Mogg Letty Jr., the original suspect from 1985. The case had finally found its resolution, at least in terms of identifying the killer. However, justice came with a bitter twist. Mag Letty had already died in 2015 while serving a life sentence in prison. He had been convicted of another brutal crime, the strangulation of Kathleen Leonard, his former neighbor in Sarasota, an offense committed just 10 years after Denise's murder. A single strand of hair had once led to his conviction in that earlier case. Over time, Mag Letty's name had surfaced in connection with other unsolved crimes as well. He was a suspected, but never officially charged perpetrator in the murder of Elizabeth Daya, a 19-year-old who was abducted near the Sarasota Square Mall and later found dead in downtown Sarasota, where she had been employed. Until his death, Mag Letty maintained his innocence in all of the killings. Though his passing denied the Stafford family the opportunity to confront him or see him sentenced for Denise's murder, there was still a degree of solace. Denise's mother, Doler Kepner, shared her bittersweet reflections. He is gone. He is not going to harm anyone else. That has been my consolation. I didn't want to see any other mother go through what our family has. She added with emotion, she was loving. She was a good daughter, and we just all loved her and miss her. Case number 2, the Denham Cold Case, the murder of Sonia Carmen Herrick Stone. Our story begins in the sun-drenched streets of Carmel, California in the late 1970s. A fresh chapter had just begun for Sonia Carmen Herrick, a woman in her early 30s, recently divorced and raising a child. She had left behind her past life in Quebec, Canada, in pursuit of a new beginning. With a job as a sales representative at Levi Strauss, she was determined to build a stable life on the West Coast. In 1976, Sonia remarried, this time to a man named Michael Stone. The couple had a child together, but sadly, that marriage too ended in divorce. Still, Sonia stayed in California, embracing a life that, on the surface, seemed normal, ordinary, uneventful, until everything changed. October 15th, 1981, a gruesome discovery. It was just past noon when Sonia's friend, Caroline McBride, arrived at her home. What she found would haunt her forever. Sonia was dead. She had been murdered earlier that morning. Sonia was only 30 years old. The police quickly launched an investigation. There were clear signs of forced entry, signs of a struggle. It looked like a robbery, but strangely, nothing valuable had been taken. Caroline McBride, the one who discovered the body, was not treated as a suspect. However, the details she provided from the scene would become pivotal later on. Despite early momentum, the case began to cool until an unexpected witness came forward. A suspicious scratch and a sudden accusation. Enter Michelle Wilson, a friend of a local man named Michael Glazebrook, who lived just across the street from Sonia. Michelle claimed that Glazebrook was at the scene of the crime on the day of the murder. Even more suspicious, Glazebrook was seen with a fresh scratch on his face, one he never seemed to explain. Could Sonia have scratched him while fighting for her life? Glazebrook had no criminal history, just a few traffic warrants, but the accusation was damning. He became the focus of the investigation. Yet, Caroline McBride, Sonia's friend, told authorities that Sonia had no connection to Glazebrook. Still, the pieces were starting to align until everything fell apart again. The case crumbles. On November 10th, 1982, over a year after the murder, Michelle Wilson retracted her testimony. She claimed that too much time had passed, and her memory was no longer reliable. She also offered a new explanation for Glazebrook's scratch, saying he told her he got it during an argument at a local college after the murder. This retraction crushed the investigation. In court, things got even messier. Glazebrook's own parents testified that they hadn't seen any scratch on his face. The judge ruled there was insufficient evidence, and the case was dismissed. A legal tangle and a vanishing trail, then came a second attempt to prosecute Glazebrook. But this time, the defense fought back hard. The court learned that Glazebrook had been arrested under false pretenses for traffic warrants and then questioned about the murder without proper cause. Evidence obtained from this process, including blood samples and statements made under pressure, was ruled inadmissible. It was deemed fruit of the poisonous tree, a legal term meaning that since the arrest was unlawful, anything gathered from it couldn't be used in court. Again, the charges were dropped. And the case? It went cold. Dead ends, contradictions, lost notes, witnesses giving conflicting statements. Even Glazebrook's alibi, playing softball on the day of the murder, was never fully verified because his teammates weren't even interviewed. 4 decades later, a breakthrough, nearly 40 years passed. Sonia's case faded into obscurity, another unsolved file in a drawer of cold cases. Until 2021, thanks to advancements in DNA technology, detectives were able to re-examine Sonia's case file, and this time, they had something solid. The evidence pointed once again to Michael Glazebrook, and this time, they were ready, armed with a new arrest warrant. Detectives paid. Glazebrook, now 65 years old, one final visit. In a tribute to Sonia's career at Levi Strauss, they wore denim jeans when they brought him into custody. He was arrested for murder, with bail set at $1 million. He is currently awaiting trial, and many hope this will finally bring closure to a case that has haunted Sonia's family and investigators for over 4 decades. Justice may be slow, but it never forgets. This is the story of Sonia Carmen Herrick Stone and the cold case that refused to stay cold. Case file number 3, the 3 Florida murders. Florida has long been a haunting backdrop to some of America's most infamous crimes. From the notorious Ted Bundy and the terrifying Gainesville Ripper, Danny Rolling, to lesser-known figures like Christine Falling and Gary Ray Bowles, this state has seen its share of killers. But among all these cases, none proved to be as mentally taxing or as physically exhausting for investigators as the 3 Florida murders, a case that spanned years, crossed international borders, and left behind a chilling trail of unanswered questions. June 2000, the nightmare begins. It started on an otherwise ordinary summer day in June 2000. In Cooper City, a quiet town just southwest of Fort Lauderdale, the body of a 35-year-old woman was discovered. Her name was Kimberly Dietz Lee. She had been brutally murdered, and the scene offered little to no initial leads. As investigators scrambled for answers, another body surfaced. This time, it was Simus, a 21-year-old woman whose lifeless form was found near Dania Beach, just miles away from where Kimberly was found. 2 murders, 2 women, 1 county, and then silence. Until a year later. In 2001, tragedy struck again. The body of 24-year-old Jessica Good was discovered floating in the waters of Biscayne Bay in Miami. 3 victims, 3 brutal endings, each young woman taken from this world far too soon. A chilling pattern emerges. As detectives examined the cases more closely, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. All 3 women had been vulnerable. They struggled with substance abuse, and they were working as sex workers at the time of their deaths. The killer knew how to find them, knew their routines, and used their vulnerabilities against them. This wasn't random. It was targeted, intentional, and cold-blooded. But then came a crucial lead, the turning point in a seemingly unsolvable case. A name surfaces: Roberto Wagner Fernandez. After interviewing Jessica Good's boyfriend, detectives were led to a suspect, Roberto Wagner Fernandez, a Brazilian national living in Miami at the time. Fernandez had a dark history. Authorities discovered a pattern of violence, especially against sex workers, and once word got out that he was a suspect in a possible serial killing case, he vanished, fleeing back to Brazil almost overnight. That escape would complicate the case for years to come. International barriers, national frustration. Fernandez's sudden flight put U.S. detectives in a legal quagmire. Because Brazil does not extradite its citizens, authorities in Florida were blocked at nearly every turn. And while they couldn't reach him in Brazil, Fernandez wasn't done. Reports of similar crimes began surfacing in his home country. Attacks on sex workers, again pointing to his violent tendencies. The Brazilian government, initially slow to act, eventually started cooperating, but the process was painfully slow, mired in legal red tape and bureaucratic hurdles. Then, in 2011, a major break. Investigators made progress in the forensic analysis of Jessica Good's case. Excited by the possibility of finally confronting Fernandez, they prepared to fly to Brazil for DNA testing. But what they discovered on arrival was shocking. Roberto Wagner Fernandez had died 6 years earlier, in a 2005 plane crash en route from Brazil to Paraguay. Or had he? A death that didn't add up. To the detectives, something about the crash and Fernandez's alleged death felt off. At a press conference, Detective Scott voiced what many of them feared had Fernandez faked his own death. It wasn't a far-fetched theory. Fernandez had amassed enemies everywhere from his murdered wife's family to countless others harmed by his violent actions. He had motives to disappear and the resources to pull it off. But law enforcement wasn't ready to give up. Working alongside the U.S. Justice Department, the FBI, and the Brazilian National Police, investigators pressed on. Years passed, governments changed, but the case never left their desks or their minds. The final chapter: DNA from the grave. Eventually, after persistent efforts and international negotiation, a Brazilian judge authorized what detectives had long hoped for: the exhumation of Roberto Fernandez's body. The grave was opened, DNA samples were taken, and the results were conclusive. The man buried in that grave was Roberto Wagner Fernandez, and his DNA matched all 3 Florida murder scenes. Justice? Almost with that confirmation, the case was finally closed. After more than a decade of relentless pursuit, investigators could now say with certainty that Fernandez was the man responsible for the brutal murders of Kimberly Dietz Lee, Simus, and Jessica Good. Broward County Sheriff Gregory Toney praised the work of detectives, many of whom had since retired, some now deceased, who never stopped searching for justice. Still, there was a bitter note to the resolution. Detective Scott reflected, "We wish we could have brought him to justice, but we couldn't. And yet, in a small way, there was solace, because Fernandez's death, according to investigators, was anything but peaceful. His final moments were filled with terror as the plane crashed into the earth. For those who chased him for years, haunted by the faces of the women he killed, this ending offered a grim, ironic form of closure." Case file number 4, The Long Road to Justice, Althea Oakley and Caitlin Arquette. It was the summer of 1988, a warm June night in Albuquerque, New Mexico. 21-year-old Althea Oakley, a bright, spirited college student, had joined her boyfriend at a fraternity party near the University of New Mexico. But what began as a night of fun quickly turned sour. An argument erupted between the couple, and Althea, upset and frustrated, decided to leave the party and walk home alone, a decision that would tragically mark the last steps of her life. As she made her way along Buena Vista Boulevard, close to campus and on a familiar path, Althea was suddenly and brutally attacked. The neighborhood would wake up to news of another young life taken, and her loved ones were left to wrestle with grief and unanswered questions. Fast forward 1 year, and the city was shaken once again. Caitlin Arquette, only 18 years old and freshly graduated from Highland High School, was driving home from a friend's house one summer night in July 1989. Caitlin wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of Lois Duncan, a well-known author of horror and thriller novels like I Know What You Did Last Summer, but reality proved far more horrifying than fiction. As Caitlin pulled up to an intersection, an unknown assailant opened fire on her car. She was struck and her vehicle drifted across 3 lanes of traffic before crashing into a light pole near Arno Street Northeast. She died shortly after. 2 young women, 2 lives stolen, and no clear answers. For over 3 decades, the Arquette and Oakley families were devastated and determined. Lois Duncan, once a best-selling horror author, abandoned her career in suspense fiction. Instead, she began writing children's books and spent the rest of her life searching for the truth behind her daughter's death. The Oakleys, too, never stopped fighting for justice. But the years dragged on, and the cases went cold. Then came a shocking twist. On July 20th, 2021, nearly 32 years after Caitlin Arquette's murder, a man named Paul Apodaca, then 53 years old, walked into the University of New Mexico Police Department and said something that stunned officers. He had information about murders from long ago. As detectives listened closely, Apodaca didn't just share information, he confessed. He admitted to killing Althea Oakley, Caitlin Arquette, and even a third woman whose identity police have not yet released. Apodaca provided a disturbingly detailed account of the night he murdered Althea. At the time, he was working as a security aide at what was then TVI, now Central New Mexico Community College. He claimed he spotted Althea in a parking lot, got into his car, and followed her, as she walked alone under the dim streetlights. She smiled at him, said, "Hi," a gesture of kindness. But that only deepened the tragedy. Apodaca told investigators, "That's the worst part. I hurt someone who smiled at me." When asked why, his answer was chilling. "I think what made me do it was all the hatred I had for women. Growing up, I saw men treating women badly, and the women went for those men. I tried to be good, but no one wanted that. So I was jealous and I just released it." It was a harrowing confession driven by resentment, misogyny, and a lifetime of unresolved anger. Albuquerque's police chief, Harold Medina, had a personal connection to this case. In 1990, he was the very first recipient of a scholarship established in Althea Oakley's memory, and now, over 30 years later, he made the solemn drive to Taos, New Mexico, to deliver the news in person to her parents. The case was no longer cold. The killer had confessed. Chief Medina later said that Althea's mother, upon seeing him, assumed he was there to inform them the case had been officially closed, another dead end. But instead, she received the bittersweet gift of long-awaited justice. Apodaca's confession to Caitlin Arquette's murder also matched key details of the crime scene. He admitted he had fired into her car at an intersection. At the time, police had discovered a gray Volkswagen Beetle suspiciously parked nearby. It belonged to Apodaca, but no one followed up. He slipped through the cracks. When asked why he killed Caitlin, his answer was again cold and detached. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The irony of it all? Apodaca's job at TVI was supposed to protect students, especially women. He was assigned to patrol parking lots and ensure female students got to their cars safely, all while hiding a violent past. Even as a juvenile, his criminal history was extensive, and just months before his 2021 confession, he had pleaded guilty to aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Apodaca, now homeless, told investigators that he'd had a spiritual awakening, that it was God's word that made him come forward after all these years. He looked an officer in the eyes and said, "It's a shame it took me this long, but now I know what I did was evil. It was dark." As of now, Paul Apodaca has been formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Althea Oakley, the case with the strongest evidence. But with his confessions and ongoing investigations, authorities say more charges are expected. The families of Althea and Caitlin waited over 3 decades for justice, and while no confession can heal the pain of lost daughters, perhaps, finally the silence that haunted these cases has been broken. The truth, buried for so long, has come to light. That concludes today's video. I truly hope this gave you valuable insight into some of the most overlooked cases throughout the years. If you found this helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications to stay updated. If you're not sure what to comment, just drop a 555. It lets me know you watched till the end. Thanks again for your time and support. There's more on the way, so stay tuned.